So I'm going to talk about DevOps and the AppSec Pipeline. And I'll just get into it. I don't need to do any much more in the title thing. So anybody know who this guy is? Henry Ford. That's Henry Ford, because back in the day, right, you used to go get a car and you'd go to a coach builder and they'd custom make a car for you according to your specs and needs. It was a really nice car, but it took kind of forever and took a lot of people and it wasn't fast. Henry Ford said, I don't like that idea. I want these assembly lines. I want everybody to put in a little bit, and let's really speed up the process. And if you wanted a car in black, black, or black, he was your man, right? And I think security, particularly AppSec, has the same problem. We've been doing a lot of coach building of assessments, and they're custom, and they're one-off, and it doesn't scale. At Pearson, I am one of, right now, 11, because we lost somebody, AppSec people, with 5,000 developers and between 1,200 and 2,000 apps, because we really don't know because no one's really counted them. So with those numbers, you're really behind the 8 ball, and I'm not going to coach build an AppSec program, right? I have to actually do something that's automated and fast. And so this is really about my getting to Pearson and saying, OMG, I'm really behind the 8 ball here in terms of people and bandwidth. How are we going to solve this problem? Oh, and incidentally, around that same time, I bought and read the Phoenix Project, which if you haven't read it, go out and read it. It is really, 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 really good. You will buy it at the right time, though, because you will stay up later than you want to and be tired for several days because you won't want to stop reading it. I actually mentioned it yesterday in a class, and one of my students came up to me and said, darn it, man, I was up super late last night because I got that book in my Kindle and I was up reading it. Like, why? Why did you do this to me? I'm like, I'm sorry, I warned you. You should have waited. But it's a great book. But in that book, Gene Kim talks about the 3 ways of DevOps. And I'm going to sort of relate those to what I did in our AppSec program. So number 1, workflow, right? Look at your purpose and the processes which aid it. So in the terms of AppSec, right, that's producing for the business you work for visibility into the applications and the security state, particularly of those applications, right, of whatever your suite of apps are. And there's also a thing they talk about in the Phoenix Project and in DevOps about the working from left to right, right? Starting with the business, going through development, going through ops, and then ending up with the customer, right? And there's a flow, this idea of flow or flow rate, which is how quickly you can go from the business across to the customer. And the quicker the flow, the more you can do experimentation, the quicker you can get things out the door. And actually do experimentations and change and modify and all that good stuff can do is deliver, etc. So the first thing in workflow is to make each step repeatable. This is where you have to sort of sit down and look at what you're doing in your program and say, what are those things that are sort of haphazard, ad hoc, I don't really have standardized, why can't I like specify what those look like and kind of make them sane? This is where things like scripting languages are an absolute friend to you, right? This doesn't need high-end, multi-threaded processing to do these things. Simple Python, Bash, Perl, you name it, scripts can be huge time savers. And hopefully if you are dealing with infrastructure, you're using Chef, Puppet, Salt, Ansible, what have you, because those are also huge friends in making your infrastructure consistent. Because now instead of looking at those end servers, you can look at that one bit of Ansible that deploys those end servers and understand if that's sane. If I am happy with how Ansible is going to deploy a web node, let's say, I can tell the ops teams to deploy as many web nodes as they want. I don't care because that Ansible will consistently deploy them. And then make sure whatever you're doing can be done not only for one server, but for 10,000, right? You have to do this at scale, even if you're not there. Because if you can do it for 10,000, you can do it fast. And that will buy you more time if you don't have 10,000 servers. And then number 2 in the workflow is never pass on defects, right? So test early and often. I have a high bias for sort of trying to a la carte a lot of our testing, and you'll see that when I talk about the pipeline. But the other thing is, the earlier you can do it, the better it is. I mean, I don't have to tell the security group that the ROI is there when you can test early. So anything that's early in the development cycle that you can get in quick, break it off and do it by itself early as possible. And then you can increase the test rigor, though, as you go from left to right, right? Because the further you go right, the more you have a final finished product or a release that you're going to deliver. If there is a failure or some kind of problem, stop there and figure out why. The biggest thing for that is because that's where you know the context and the situation and you understand the problem space. If you wait a day or two, it's gone. It's flushed from cache. You have to sort of recreate that if nothing else in your mind. I don't need to, I already said that the more expensive as you go left to right. And for me, in AppSec, false positives are defects. right? If you're passing on non-actionable false positives to your dev teams, you're doing them a disservice. You're actually hurting the business because they're burning time, proving to you that you're wrong instead of actually making the product that your business is trying to sell. So like false positives are the work of the devil in my mind. Don't pass them on. And then local optimizations have to have a global understanding. So when you have this workflow figured out, you can't optimize something downstream that will run dry because upstream can't produce fast enough, right? So it's the idea you have to pick where you're optimizing such that the flow increases, not just that one isolated area increases. So if you pick a downstream bottleneck and you make it really fast, if upstream can't pump whatever work into that step quick enough, you're just going to end up running dry. And every time you optimize something, you will produce a new bottleneck, and that's okay, because you can just continually iterate on that, right, and slowly make it better. And honestly, if you are doing this iteratively, you have a much better chance of it working out because you're never going to have the 6 weeks to make the final thing, but you are going to have slices of time throughout every week to do little pieces. Okay, so let's talk about AppSec Pipelines and figuring out your workflow. So everybody knows this analogy, right? You want a custom burrito from this burrito shop, and you go in and say, well, I want chicken and black beans and guacamole and the Mexican-style rice or whatever it is, right? And you get your custom taco, but it's quick, right? So they've assembly-lined custom tacos, right? And this is kind of what we need to do for AppSec, right? We need something like this. We have a la carte menu where you can select the bits that make sense for you. In the case of AppSec, makes sense for risk, right? The risk can drive what you select, but having this, the ability to be flexible, but also quick is vitally important. So AppSec Pipelines. And to make a distinction, for me, an AppSec pipeline is the pipeline of workflow of an application security team. So I was initially concentrating when I got to Pearson and just making our house in order, right? When I got to Pearson, they had just taken 6 very large companies and mashed them together into one ridiculously large company of 40K people. And there was a centralized CISO group that was starting up AppSec. And in some regards, that was pretty cool because we had a kind of a blank slate. Like, what are we going to do with this thing? We're now the SMEs for AppSec. How do we handle this? And it took a lot of work to sort of think through this problem. But the biggest thing we did is figure out our workflow. Like, what do we really want to do? What's our problem space? And what are those steps that make it? So here's a generic model of an AppSec workflow. Well, this is obviously related to what we did at Pearson. But you start here where you have people asking for services, like we are about to launch an app. We want to have an assessment, what have you. Whatever it is, we need a retest of these issues that we fixed, right? Those go into some kind of services and request repository where you're keeping track of these requests and understanding what apps you've seen and not seen. Also, most places I've worked at in AppSec groups don't have a list of apps. And so we don't have a list of apps either, but we do have a list of every app we've seen. And so the more apps we see, the bigger our list gets, and we'll eventually get to the point where we have a pretty good inventory of all of our apps. From here, you may need some kind of orchestration layer to do some alerting and eventing. If you're provisioning security services, you'll also have that tied into your orchestration layer. You might farm out work to a threat model or manual assessments, because there's really not much automation you can do with those. You'll have one or more tools here that you want to automate and run based on risk. So at Pearson, we pick how risky you are. We have a 4-tier system. If you're tier 1, you get light touch. If you're tier 4, you get heavy touch, right? It's all kind of based on a bunch of risk criteria metadata that we collect. But you have some number of tools here that can run in parallel and do assessments of your apps. We collect all those into a vulnerability repository where we normalize and make sane the data from all these disparate tools because everyone has to have their own magic format because they're all little snowflakes, at least in terms of the reporting. We take those defects and we push them into defect trackers. So it's just a normal bug flow for an app team. It's just got a special tag of security. We pull metrics and reporting out of the same repository. In the case that we do have false positives, there's a way for our guys to go in and mark them as such in our vulnerability database. And then if you have a GRC tool or something, you can also feed those. You can feed SOCs. Like if SOCs want information of vulnerabilities to write WAF rules or some such thing, right? All of that can come out of here because it's all centralized and normalized. We have named these sort of positions of intake, triage, where you're kind of deciding what to do, testing, and then deliver. That's sort of our names for this generic pipeline. Oh, come on. Really? Stupid thing. Technology's awesome. It's job security. So what are the key features of an AppSec pipeline? Probably the biggest thing is that it's designed to iteratively improve. We didn't start in January with an AppSec pipeline was finished. We started actually with a paper sketch. Well, I finally made it a graphical thing. But I started on paper just drawing it out, like, what are we going to do here, right? And we did little pieces, and now we have a pretty robust system. But it didn't start that way. The biggest thing is it provides a reusable path, because we have a range of people. We have 3 senior people, and then some middling and some junior people. And for us, we needed something that worked, you know, for the people who are much more senior and really don't need hand-holding, but some of these junior guys need some hand-holding. Well, if we have reliable, repeatable, well-understood steps, for those junior people, they know what they're going to do. The nice thing, it provides a consistent flow. We know what happens. If we're doing a manual assessment, these things happen. If we're doing a dynamic assessment, these things happen. It's all just kind of well-known and understood. We have a one-way flow with well-defined states, so we know where your app is in the process of being assessed. We rely heavily on automation, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And we've grown this thing over time, and probably the biggest thing is we tried to figure out how to gracefully interconnect with all the different dev groups, right? We don't want to be I think that we talk in DevOps about the bad old days of ops and devs where the code was thrown over the wall. I think those giant frickin' PDFs that we used to give to developers are the same thing. We're chucking huge PDFs over the wall and saying, hey, dev guys, go figure out this huge PDF in a language you don't speak, and let me know when you're done. Like, that is doing nobody a service. So here's the actual pipeline we have set up at Pearson. So we have requests coming into an app that we wrote called Bag of Holding. It's up on GitHub. It's Apache licensed. We have an orchestration layer. We're using StackStorm for that to do some eventing and alerting. We do a little bit of provision of security services now. I'll talk about that in a minute. Or we farm out to manual assessment. And then for the automation part, we have these various tools that we use in various combinations based on risk, right? Not everybody gets all of these tools. If you're a really risky app, you'll probably get most of them. If you're not so risky an app, maybe you'll get some of them. And things like Qualys, quite honestly, a different business unit bought Qualys, and they have WAS, and they're running it. So we thought, hey, cool, we'll just suck in those results and get even more visibility about what's going on in the AppSec world. AppSec world at Pearson, anyway. We take all of those results, and they all get jammed into ThreadFix. And that's our one source of truth for all of our findings. And basically, I tell our guys, if it's not in ThreadFix, you didn't do it. So if you want credit for doing something, it better end up here, right? That's how we actually know. And then since everything is accumulated in here, including the manual assessments, I pull all the reporting, we push to Jira. Once we actually get Archer set up, we'll push to Archer. And the false positives can be removed all in there, right? So this gives us sort of one source of truth for all of our vulnerabilities that we can pull out and make sane, which is fantastic. And it's funny because really hardly anybody logs into this anymore. It's got a REST interface, and I just pull the metrics out with REST, munge them to my heart's content, and produce what I need to, which is fantastic. I don't know about you, but I'm sick of having that one other web console to log into. Like, I have 10 more of those than I want in my life now. I don't need 10 more again. And then we are working on, we're not quite there yet. Well, we're getting close to doing this now at Pearson. But there's no reason to say if you have a DevOps or some kind of build pipeline, that you can't have tooling in there that then connects in to your pipeline, right? In essence, you could either wire it into the orchestration layer and understand how to, suck it through into the vulnerability repository, or it might just actually end up being another one of these tests. It's just not a test that I run on my own security iron, air quotes, but it's something that runs in somebody's build pipeline, and they ship in results to the REST interface of ThreadFix, and we're done, right? So although I'm talking mostly about the workflow of an AppSec team, there's nothing to say this can't be integrated and pull in results from an external DevOps pipeline, right? At Pearson, I had somebody ask me, what's the average app like at Pearson? And I have everything from a classic ASP that's quite old, written by third parties that are probably no longer even in business, and stuff that's auto-scaling on Amazon. So you tell me what the average is of that, right? That range is so broad, the average is kind of meaningless. So I have to, unfortunately, accommodate all that spectrum of maturity. And so since our house is in order, at least that makes me dealing with the laggards, so to speak, and the people that are progressive. It makes it possible, at least at speed. So I love this Deming quote. Spending time optimizing anything other than the critical resource is an illusion. And my supposition to you is that the critical resource in AppSec is people, right? I don't know about you, but I do not have enough people on my AppSec team. I doubt anybody here says they have too many people on their AppSec team. So that's the critical thing for me that we really had to optimize. And basically our simple criteria is anything that doesn't take a human brain, we want to automate. Now we haven't gotten there yet, but we're getting closer. And that's the sort of goal. The cool thing about that is our consistency is way, way up. Right? All those little sniggly, stupid things that you have to do that really don't take any thinking, if those are automated, guess what? They get done the same every stinking time. If you're tired and had a bad day or your wife yelled at you on the way out, it doesn't matter. It's going to be consistently done, at least the automated stuff. And one thing that's been fantastic is we have much better tracking of our work status, particularly because of Bo, which I have some screenshots later. We know what everybody's working on and what they're assigned to and what's pending and what hasn't have somebody assigned to, and we can have a really good idea of the work in progress, which is a key kind of Kanban idea of understanding how much we can put through this pipeline at one time before we sort of burst. We have great visibility in metrics now. I think it's been kind of like, unfortunately, it's almost been like doling out crack a little bit to the business units because we got asked initially, hey, can you tell us this? And you're like, yeah, sure, here you go. We're like, oh, well, if you can tell us that, can you tell us the other thing? I'm like, oh, yeah, sure, here you go. We want more now. I'm like, oh, geez, I got all these guys jonesing for metrics now, and it's actually almost annoying, but it's flattering too. And the really cool thing is we've really reduced the dev and AppSec team friction, which is fantastic. So let's talk about intake. This is sort of your first impression with your constituency, which is mostly going to be the project management or product owner groups and whatever your business is. And if you think about it, you're either going to have an existing app that you haven't seen before, a new app that's greenfield, an app that maybe you've previously tested, or maybe there's an app that you need to do some retesting for because they've fixed some things. Key concepts here for us when we were doing Bo is ask for data about the apps only once. Prior to our intake process, every time you wanted to interact with the AppSec group, you filled out this big long form that asks you every possible something you might want to know about AppSec every time, which you can tell what that leads to data quality, right? I'm going to fill out the 2 or 3 mandatory fields. I'm going to scroll to the bottom. I'm going to hit submit. Right? So we just got crap data in continually. Now we only ask them the first time. If we see you again, we have in the database now all the stuff you told us last time. We simply say, hey, last time you said you were Tomcat and this and this and this. Is that still true? If not, click here and we can update it. Otherwise, move along, right? That was a huge bonus for us. Oh, and then we've had to adapt the data based on, we have a wide range of product teams, and 6 big companies getting mashed together, you can imagine. So we've done a lot of metadata collection inside of Bo because we really don't know how we're going to have to slice and dice this data. And I'll show you in Bo, we have a tagging system, which has really been fantastic because now we can sort of munge that data. If all of a sudden there's a Tomcat vulnerability, we have a technologies category that lets us mark the technologies of that app. We can go sort all by Tomcat. Let me see the Tomcat things. These are the apps we got to go find and talk to, right? Which has also been fantastic. Testing. So inbound requests get triaged. We use the orchestration layer primarily to help us with automation and do workflow type work. But the cool thing is we have a la carte AppSec testing, right? Any of these things in the middle we can do or not do based on risk and based on throughput and whatever we need to make that decision on, which has been fantastic. They can be done in parallel. Where we have automation and not full automation, we've really tried to do the setup. Hand the analyst everything they need to just go, right? If you're doing a manual assessment, you're getting your paracreds, your URL, your dates that you can test, all that gets handed to you, right? So you just need to take that and go. So maybe we haven't fully automated it, but we've made it as simple as possible for the human to get up and going. Yeah, we're having the people focus on customization. And really what that turns into is working with AppScan, working with Veracode or checkmarks, and optimizing those tools, the profiles, the scan profiles of those tools, so that we get the least noisy scans, right? Because if you run AppScan or you name your dynamic scan and you click next 5 times, you get a very loud result set. If you actually go in and remove the checks that don't make sense, you can actually reduce the false positives and make it a much less noisy scan. And so that's something a human brain needs, so that's something we've been focusing on. And usually we iterate about 3 times on that, and then we feel safe with that profile, and we'll just keep reusing that profile. It still requires a human brain, at least for those first 3 times. Pipeline testing. Oh, yes. The results during CI/CD should flow into thread fix from a pipeline. If you're running, this is if you're bringing in from an external pipeline. Gauntlet test, right, could also be sucked into that same pipeline. You might have to coerce them into the format that ThreadFix knows if you're using ThreadFix, but that's fairly simple. And then you just have to choose tools that make sense. Like, I have a very high bias for tools that are very specific and have a low false positive rate. I'd rather run 4 very tightly controlled specific tools like SSL cipher checks, which are really easy to get right and very hard to get wrong. I'd rather run those in a build process where I know if they fail, I know they fail. I do not want to have a red Jenkins for something that's a false positive. That's really, really, really awful. So I'd much rather have a much smaller subset of testing in the build, but I know those tests are going to actually be actionable, not false positive. And then delivery. This is sort of where you really interact with your constituency. And like I said, our ThreadFix is our source of knowledge for everything. And ThreadFix is nice for us. It'll dedupe and consolidate findings. So if you have 2 different tools, find the same cross-site scripting on the same page, that's one finding in ThreadFix, which is a huge thing. I don't want to report the same issue 3 times because 3 different tools found it. And then it normalizes scanner data into a fairly sane data model as opposed to the schizophrenic ones you get from the tool outputs. I don't know if you ever tried to parse or read those. They're awful. And because these are all normalized and centralized, I can generate metrics in a whole bunch of different ways, right? Do I want to know all of how well is static doing for this business unit? I can do that. Do I want to know how much dynamic is doing across our full portfolio? I can do that. If I want to know dynamic and dynamic results for one app, I can do that because it's all in a database. And fantastically, it has a REST interface, so I can do this all with a bit of coding. I tend to write stuff in Go. TF Client is a Go library that's up on GitHub I wrote to talk to the ThreadFix REST API. My coworker wrote one in Python. Whatever you like, it doesn't matter. It's pretty simple REST interface, right? Talk to it, pull what you need. You can do it with curl, right? This is REST. It's not that bad. And then the other thing is pushing issues directly into bug trackers, which is fantastic, right? Because now you've made it the normal flow of work for an app team. You're not some weird chuck it over the wall thing. You do need like a security tag or some kind of flag on those bugs so you can differentiate them from functional bugs, but that's really it, right? Otherwise, they just to be handled like bugs. And this is obviously where you're talking to a lot of external teams. Like our ISOC reached out to us and said, hey, you know, we're starting to set up WAFs and we want to do some WAF stuff and we know you guys are finding things, so can you give us vulnerability reports so that we can write WAF rules? And I said, no, I'm not going to give you a vulnerability report. And they're like, well, why not? I'm like, because, whoops, ThreadFix can generate WAF rules based on a finding. How about I just give you a WAF rule? And they're like, you can do that? And I'm like, yes, I can. And I'm like, guess what? It's even in the API. Like, tell me what you want to write against, and I'll give you an API key, and you can just pull it yourself. And they were like, so I ended up emailing them to them. They don't do APIs. But whatever, like, they get WAF rules for free. And it's automated for me, so I don't have to deal with it. But that's really cool. Like, that's a great kind of interaction with another external team. Oh, and I have to give credit to my favorite optimizing the critical resource. That was Deming. If you don't know Deming, he was the guy who helped take Toyota, or, well, Japan rather, and Toyota and the other Japanese manufacturers from bombed to crushing America cars with cute little things like this, right? We got our clock cleaned by Japan with little fun cars that were cheap and very serviceable. And Deming was one of the people who went over to Japan and really taught them how to do that with factories. And a lot of the DevOps movement has taken his work that he did for physical manufacturing and applied it to IT. I think we do the very same thing for AppSec. So why do we like pipelines? Well, we have great visibility into our work in progress. So if I have a manager come to me and say, oh my goodness, there's a fire, so-and-so wants to launch tomorrow, drop everything and go. Like, ugh. I mean, I kind of know what's going on, but I don't really remember what's going on. I can log into Bo and tell them exactly, you want me to take 4 people off of what they're working on and go work on this, that's fine. But here's the 4 things that aren't going to get done. Are you cool with that? If you're cool with that, fine. If you're not, like, let's talk. Right? But I couldn't really have intelligent conversations like that until I had a well-defined workflow and understood the state of all of my people. We've been able to better understand and optimize engagements and know the ones that are taking long and cherry pick those for automation, right? The things that are taking long are the things I want to look at as potential for optimization. I don't want to work and spend any, even if it might be cool, spend time automating the thing that's going fast. Like, why? That doesn't bias anything. We've certainly gotten great consistency, crazy great consistency. And I can tell you, like, the average time it takes to do activity X is so long. And I can do that not with just from the hip, because I've been doing this for a long time, kind of a guesstimate. I can actually give you numbers because we track that now. We can reallocate people easier. I love that it has a well-defined interface, so it's really easy to talk about where you are with the various people that are on our team. And it's flexible enough for a range of skills, like I said. There's some people that are very, very new on our team and some people that are very, very senior. And we needed something that worked for all of them. So for the senior people, it's just less thinking they have to do. And for the junior people, it's actually some hand-holding and guidance, which has been fantastic. Oh, the other thing that I really like about our AppSec pipeline is 4x plus. And what that means is last year in 2014, we did 43 assessments. This year, we're on track to do 200. So we've had a slight increase in productivity, year 1 to year 2. And it's fantastic. I mean, we were very much the shiny example in the CISO group that they kind of just, they really didn't know. We did this total skunk works. We just kind of took 2 people, myself and another guy. We just quietly stopped testing and started building the pipeline. It didn't kind of tell anybody. And now they just leave us alone because they're seeing huge productivity gains. And we're way ahead of the ballpark with our neighbors in CISO, so we're kind of the golden children, which is fantastic. I can't complain. So Bag of Holding, that app that we use for intake, that's Apache licensed and up on GitHub. That's what we did to handle our intake, because before it was a bunch of god-awful Google spreadsheets in various places that were a mess. How does this thing do this? It doesn't like me. Really? This is my first time using Google presentation. I'm not sold. So what does Bo do for us? It is our inventory of application, and it manages pretty much all of our application inventory in terms of people management, who's doing what active engagements are, what activities go in those engagements. It's our application repository, so as we learn of applications, this is our definitive list of what we have out there. And we gather a ton of metadata about it so that we have better ideas to make risk-based decisions. For us, an engagement is basically a simple bucket to put 1 or more testing activities in. So a low-risk app might only get 2 activities in their engagement, and a high-risk app may have 6 in their engagement. But it's just sort of a nice catch-all for us to have multiple activities categorized into one thing. We have a report repository where if we do reporting, we try not to do reporting, but some groups still want it. So if you want a traditional PDF-y thing, fine, we'll leave that there. And for every application engagement or activity, we have a comments field, so I can leave kind of notes if I have to switch off and move to a different thing. Hey, watch out, this thing's really twitchy with the CSRF token or whatever. Make sure you set this up correctly. If you ever mess with this cookie, it'll log you out, whatever. You can leave little hints to whoever's coming behind you. We have the data classification and PII in there with the risk rating, so you can actually say what I have, social security numbers and student IDs and credit cards, and we'll give you a risk score. We're measuring the time it takes to do all of our different software or AppSec activities. That's how we can actually tell you now it takes so long to do a dynamic or a static or whatever. The really nice thing is historical knowledge of past assessments. If you've ever been in an AppSec team, you've had a manager or VP or somebody come up to you, go in a panic, when was the last time we looked at App X? Which tells you there's probably something wrong with App X. And they want to know if they're going to get shot for it or not. Now I can go into Bo and say, well, the last time we looked at it was back in May, and we did a static analysis and a dynamic with AppScan, whatever it is, right? I can find that really quickly because it's just all in the database. We keep credentials there so that you as an AppSec person logs into Bo, what you're supposed to be working on is there, and what you need to work on it is there. So you go into Bo and you pretty much have all you need. Oh, I'm doing a manual assessment. Here's the environment I'm testing against, and here are the creds. Done, right? Nice and simple. Oh, and that's the environmental details, right? And we keep track of multiple environments per app. So you can have pre-prod, prod, testing, whatever. You also have this idea of if those environments are clear for testing or not. Like, oh, you cannot test in prod, so that's red. Those kind of things. Stupid thing. So here's an idea of the software activities. This is the team dashboard, not your own dashboard. That's the My Dashboard thing. That shows you what your work is. But for a team, this shows you here's our users, here's our engagements. I don't have any empty engagements. I have some unassigned activities, so I got to hand this threat model out to somebody, right? The dates they're requested on, all those things are in the dashboard. And then this is our application repository. And probably the biggest thing is all of these are criteria that we can filter on, right? Besides name, business unit or organization, and criticality, any of these other metrics, metadata that we keep, we can filter on. See, we have 289 last time I checked apps in Bow and ThreadFix. And so it's getting to be a pretty big number. So like being able to filter those things has gotten to be super, super handy. And for each app, we'll have a name, the org, these criticality metrics, and these little, I have to mouse over them, I still can't remember them, but these little icons stand for different things. Like the house means it's in-house developed, those kind of things. And then the arbitrary tags are over here. And this is an example of a particular app where we have ThreadFix integration, where these are the vulnerability totals taken out of the ThreadFix API. Here's all the metadata we know about it. You know, there's 4,500 users, we make so much money. Resources is what other resources this app is in. So in our case, it's in ThreadFix. Here's the different technology stacks, any regulations that apply, and any arbitrary tags. Right? And all that's just sort of in your face when you look at an application, so it's pretty easy for somebody who's senior at least to go in and go, oh, yeah, this needs these things. This idea of service level agreements, I don't like the label, to be honest with you, but that's our idea of the tiering of testing. So our service level agreement with you is you're a tier 4 app, you're going to get the full Monty. You're a tier 1 app, you're going to get a light touch. That kind of thing. So improve feedback. Open yourself up. This is the second of the 3 ways of DevOps. Open yourself up to upstream and downstream information and get that feedback so you can use that feedback to further optimize your system. Oh, and this is just my cry to every security person and everybody out there. Please go to your vendors and go out to the vendors and do your little passport thing at LastCon and ask them, how's your API? Is it REST? Can I see the docs? Because I am so sick of logging into web apps. And those end up being little islands of data that are hard to extract data from, particularly programmatically. So please ask them for APIs. Please, insane REST APIs, ideally. So one of the cool things we did, which does help with feedback, is we created a chat bot, or we're doing ChatOps if we really want to be hipsters, with this thing called Will. So Will is a little Python bot that knows how to sit in a hip chat channel and do things. And we're using StackStorm to do some of the workflow around that. So when you ask the bot to do something, the things it does are actually stored in StackStorm. So here's an example of asking the bot. You go AppSec bot help, and it'll tell you all the different things it'll do. Checkmarks integration, it'll give you advice, it'll give you information on apps. You can list apps, you can get stats on apps, you can get a summary of what's going on with the AppSec team, etc. So for example, you can, and this is in our public AppSec channel, you can ask the bot for advice on cross-site scripting. It'll say, oh, cross-site scripting is blah, blah, blah. Here's resources to our AppSec library internally where you can read more, right? What other information do you know? I also know about SQL injection, cookies, and some of our tools. And we're slowly building out this list of things that we can ask, because we're on every continent except for Antarctica, and I sleep sometimes, so do the other people on our teams, although luckily we are kind of spread around the globe a bit. But if someone's not around, you can always get baseline advice from our bot, which is pretty freaking cool. The other thing you can do, at least in our internal channel, is ask the status of an app, because particularly the AppSec manager was getting a lot of drive-bys saying, hey, what's going on with app X? Jump into your hip chat, ask the bot, this is your vulnerability count as it stands at this moment. Right, done. Right, instead of like, hold on, let me log into ThreadFix and find your thing, and right? We have this to create an application, which has been super handy because it creates an application in Bow and in ThreadFix, so they're consistent, which is really good. You can get summary metrics for the AppSec program as well. And probably I think the coolest thing is our ThreadFix and static integration. So if you ask them, hey AppSec bot, for checkmarks with this application and this org, here's my repository, go do your thing. And in his case, go do your thing is see if it's in Bow. If it isn't in Bow, add it. See if it's in ThreadFix. If it isn't in ThreadFix, add it. Go to checkmarks. Add this application in checkmarks, point checkmarks at its repository. By default, set up a regularly week, pull the source code out and analyze it, job, and come back and give them a link to where they are in ThreadFix if you want to go look it up. And then the other half of this is I wrote a little program that runs, I think we run it every 4 hours, that goes and looks in the output directory for checkmarks, and anything in there, it gets shoved up into ThreadFix. So now within a minute or so, we have reoccurring weekly static analysis of a tool that automatically gets pushed into our vulnerability repository, done. Like with one little chat command, which has been so fantastic. Actually, in January, we said, oh, we'll probably need N number of licenses for checkmarks this year. We'd be lucky if we get that many. We've burned through them, and we actually had to buy more licensing, right? Because this is happening so fast. Instead of an email that sits in somebody's inbox and bounces around and Now it's just done. Because if somebody asks me, I can jump into the hip chat and go boop, 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 and then we're finished. Continuing experimentation and learning. Create a culture of innovation and experimentation. This is sort of the third of the 3 ways of DevOps, and the sort of ultimate pinnacle of this is being the unicorny chaos monkey running Netflix, right? That's sort of the end goal if you can get there. Certainly something to shoot for. Oh, and I love this quote because I said it. Failures only serve to limit the scope of what must be tried to succeed. And this is a cultural thing where you really have to work with your team to be cool with saying, look, this didn't work. Like there was one thing I promised to the business units that I was going to do metrics in one particular way that I was pretty darn sure I could do. And guess what? By Thursday, when I was supposed to give it to them, by Friday, I realized, ooh, it's just flat. Isn't going to work. Okay, thanks. What am I going to do? I'm going to talk to the business unit. I'm going to say, hey, guys, I thought it was going to work. It wasn't going to work. I can get it to you by Wednesday of next week. Is that cool? Yeah, they were cool with that. Fine. Like, it's just a matter of having an adult conversation and not being afraid to say you messed up. Oh, and I love this quote, too. I fear not the man who has practiced 10,000 kicks once, but I fear the man who has practiced one kick 10,000 times. And once you have that workflow and it just becomes the normal way you do things, you get really quick at it and it just becomes second nature. You don't have to think about it. It just happens. We've got a project, myself and Aaron and a bunch of other people, Josh Corman, Shannon from Intuit, oh shoot, I'm forgetting her name, from Target. My bad, I apologize if I am being recorded, so I apologize. But a bunch of us are getting together that are doing kind of AppSec and pipeline work and trying to gather a bunch of use cases so that, because I know what worked for me at Pearson is great, and it works great at Pearson, but it probably doesn't work great at your company. You're going to have to make it fit your business situation. So we're trying to get a decent amount of case studies to say, this is how we solve this problem at X. And put those up so you have some kind of guidance to do this. The other thing we're working on is creating a list of tools and saying where they work in that pipeline. If they have APIs, do they scale horizontally? All these sort of concerns you have if you're trying to do this at scale and at speed. And we just started this, actually, we kind of launched this OS project at AppSec US 2 weeks ago. So it's pretty new, but we're getting a ton of traction. So keep an eye on that. Key takeaways, automate, automate, automate. If nothing else, look for paper cuts and get rid of those, because all of us probably have to work. We didn't drive our Ferrari here. Maybe you did. If you did, cool on you. I didn't. I drove my Fiat, which is close, but much smaller. But look for those paper cuts and get rid of them, right? Like, get rid of the paper cuts, because if you have to spend 8 hours a day doing this, plus 8+ hours a day doing this, you might as well not have those aggravating things that drag you down. And then I really, really, really think you should work on finding out what your workflow is and get that laid out and get that well understood. Because then you can really start making intelligent decisions about optimizing that and where you need to make automation and get the biggest gains. And the funny thing is, there's some really big early gains. I mean, we were doing like 4 or 5 emails back and forth, and somebody would have to manually log into check marks and remember what it was, manually log into Bo and manually log into ThreadFix and put in the application. We got that down to a chatbot in a minute. Like, holy cow, there's some big ROI in that, right? And then probably the second biggest thing is create systems that grow organically, right? Understand that you're never going to get the 2 weeks of lead time to just write this thing, or months. We really worked pretty hard on it for 3 months, kind of a skunkworks thing initially. But just find little things that you can do a little piece at a time and just keep adding. That's what we've done this whole year, adding little pieces to our pipeline as we go, slowly making it better. And then learn to talk dev. Like if you can't say, oh man, yeah, I had this time where I had to pip install this thing and it wasn't in the repository and I app got it and it didn't work. Like if you can't have that kind of dev-y conversation with your devs, you're already kind of on your back foot, right? So the more you can learn to sort of speak devish, the better you are because you're speaking their language, if devish is a word. And thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, sure. So the question was about not doing reports, but pushing stuff into defect trackers. The way we do that is with the API, and it's automated. Luckily for us, ThreadFix does that for us. Now, ThreadFix, you do have to go in and sort of, and this is not automated, but this is one of the times where I'm happy it's not automated. You go in and say, these 3 cross-site scriptings that affect this page, they're 1 bug instead of 3. Because I don't like the idea of automatically mapping every finding to a bug, because sometimes you can wrap them up together into 1 bug of multiple findings. So that was a big plus for us, even though it is manual. In terms of the result, we have a 40% increase in or decrease in time to fix for the business unit that we've done Jira integration with versus those we don't. So pretty good number.
What about the developer response and interaction?
Funny enough, I mean, my response, or well, the way I would measure the response is I haven't had any complaints. It's not a great way to measure it, but no one's complained, so I'm feeling pretty good about it. I haven't explicitly gone out and asked them, but the team that or the business unit we're doing this with, higher ed, seems very happy.
Faster remediation?
Yeah, well, and the funny thing is, this business unit that we did this with, we did this, the monthly report to the CISO group, or quarterly, whatever it was, and we said, here's our rates, and you had, other business unit rates and their rate, and everyone was like, why are they so quick? We want to be quicker, right? So it actually, now I'm getting this sort of people coming to us saying, why can't you integrate with us, instead of me telling them I want to integrate with them. So that's been fantastic. It's two places. One, it's doing that profile work and running the scan semi-manually the first 2 or 3 times to get a profile that's sane and we feel comfortable with. Once we get that in place, then it's in ThreadFix. We're trying to keep them out of there as much as possible by keeping those profiles tuned. So even though it's automated, the first couple times it's semi-automated because we want to get a sane profile. So like some of our teams, the first time we do check marks with them, we'll actually go in and run it and look at the results in us, false positive, false positive, false positive, save that as our profile, let it run again, see how that looks. These, okay, what we got? No, we're pretty stable. Okay, we're good now. And then we just let it run. So it's a hybrid, really. But we're trying to get them in the testing phase as much as possible. So we don't have cruft actually in the vulnerability database, honestly. Yeah, I don't know how your Jira is set up, but our Jira is set up by business unit and team inside of the business unit. So for someone to see the defects that we're pushing in, well, there's 2 things. Well, there's 2 things. Ours is a slightly more complicated because we had so many applications in the HE business unit that we actually talked to them and said, hey, we don't feel like we can confidently map all of these apps to the dev teams they really go to in Jira. That's like that one-to-many relationship. It's not our domain. We don't know. And so our agreement with the business unit was they gave us a backlog that's a business backlog, that business unit backlog. We push all of those into the business unit backlog, and they have somebody who's in their project group who knows the projects that shoves them into the right backlog. But for us, in terms of who can see it, the way our Jira is set up is you have to be in that business unit to get into the business unit, and then to get into the specific project, you have to be on a dev team in that project. So we have off there, so I'm really not too worried about it. I'm going to have to tell the developers at some point anyway, so meh, right? So, but that's, we're really kind of, we are a little bit dancing around that, but it's because, at least in our case, the Jira auth is set up pretty sane. Wire up time really isn't that big for any of them, but the time lag for us is the manual. When you stick on manual, that's where it gets long. Because we're pretty good about, we're working now on getting AppScan automated to where we can set up, if we have a profile already, we'll just rescan that profile. Right now it's hand one of the junior guys the creds and they go make sure there's a profile and do that. So really the setup time is not that hard because most of those interactions are pretty automated or that we have really clean handoffs. The real time is the manual assessments. That's where we have the time sync. Almost all of the bits in there, like the technology stack and the risk ratings, and we have different statuses if you're in building or sustain, or we have these Pearson specific statuses that an app is in. All of those are in rows in a database, so you can modify all that stuff. So it's pretty abstract. And we tried to keep all those, because we use very specific, Pearson specific labels for the statuses of an app. Your statuses will be very different. And so those are all just rows in a database, so you change the row values and you're done. There's an issue thing on GitHub if you get lost. And it's a Django app, so we have a fair amount of the databases fronted with proper UI, but we also have the Django admin, and the Django admin gives you access to any of the tables that exist in that Django application, so you can, in a UI, web UI, poke at any of the bits of the database. It just may not be as pretty. Thank you.